as I bring up our presenters, I'm sure they'll offer you a time when you can ask questions, but we'll do that. As you can see, you can read clearly. We have Attorney Wendy Litzer from Hands, Arrow Dog, and Harris. And she is, most of you all are probably familiar with her. She's been around for a while and has represented the college in many cases. And Dr. Andrew Agnew, who is also an adjunct for Bishop State Community College, among the many titles that she held. I'll let them introduce themselves, and we can go ahead and get started. Thank you much.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's good to be with you. Do I need to put the microphone on for the recording purpose? I'm getting situated. My name is Wendy Bitzer. I'm an attorney here in Mobile at the Hands, Arrow Harrison Sale Firm, and it's been a pleasure to work with a number of you on certain situations as they've arisen over the last couple of years. And I've also been here to do some training, some of your annual training that you're required to do on on your faculty days at the beginning of semester, so I recognize a good number of your faces. It's good to see you all. Thanks again for being here today. Dr. Agnew and I have worked together on some training things before, and we have been asked to provide training to you today on the college's obligations under federal law to provide reasonable accommodations to students who have registered disabilities, so that all students are given equal access to educational opportunities. We'll also discuss the proper process for responding to a student's request. Would they come to anyone here at the college seeking academic adjustments because of a disability that they may have? This is an important topic, and even if you've received training on student disability services before, I hope this will serve as a good refresher to you. And as Mr. McSwain mentioned, this is a mandatory training. The Department of Education has mandated that Bishop State Student Services Group and all faculty, who will be trained a little bit later this week, go through this exercise as a refresher to remind you about what the applicable law is and what your responsibilities are to ensure that disabled students receive the services that they deserve. So make sure, as Roderick mentioned, please make sure you've signed in. We have to submit the listing of everyone's, the sign-in sheet to the department when we report that you've been through this training. So please do make sure that you've signed in before you leave today. All right, so during today's training, we will talk about what the applicable law is with respect to students who have disabilities and what is required of both the college and of students themselves. We're also going to discuss the college's policies and procedures, both as detailed in the current ADA Student Services Handbook, which is available on the Bishop State website. And we'll also talk about some other practical considerations, particularly, and again, this segment is focused on you all who work in the Student Services Division specifically. So we'll talk about some practical things for you to keep in mind as you serve your students. We're also going to talk about the college's ADA resources. And as a Student Services staff member, you're here at the college to serve students. And so we want to make sure that you're doing that appropriately and in compliance with the obligations for the college. So let's talk about the applicable law first. And we've divided our presentation today kind of into a legal section and then some more practical application, which Dr. Agnew will describe in detail to you. But let's first talk about the applicable law. There are two laws at place. There are two federal laws. The first is called the Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, and the second law at play is Title II of the Americans with Disabilities Act. The purpose of these two laws is virtually the same, which is prohibiting discrimination on the basis of disability. And there's really little, if any, practical difference between those two laws for the college, and so they're often referred to jointly. If you read and receive any sort of disability services memorandum or updates through emails or journals or that sort of thing, you'll hear Section 504 and Title II referred to together. And the language of Section 504, we have it on the screen. It says, "No otherwise qualified individual with a disability shall solely by reason of his or her disability be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any program or activity receiving federal financial assistance." So that's Section 504. That applies to schools that receive federal financial assistance, as Bishop State Community College does. Now, Title II of the ADA extends those same disability protections to all public entities, including state institutions. So again, Bishop State, as a state institution, falls within the coverage of Title II. So both of those laws, which are for all practical purposes the same, prohibiting discrimination, apply to the college. So when Congress was enacting both of those laws, it gathered data to support legislation, as it normally does, and Congress made these findings, specifically that millions of Americans have one or more physical or mental disabilities, and the number is increasing. Individuals with disabilities constitute one of the most disadvantaged groups in society. Disability is a natural part of the human experience, and in no way diminishes the right of individuals to, among other things, make choices, contribute to society, pursue meaningful careers, and enjoy full inclusion and integration in the educational mainstream of American society. Congress also articulated the purpose for enacting these two laws, which include, among other things, to empower individuals with disabilities to maximize their employment, economic self-sufficiency, independence, inclusion, and integration into society. The purpose also is to ensure that students with disabilities have opportunities for post-secondary success. So what is a qualified, or who is a qualified individual with a disability? In the post-secondary educational context, this means that a student meets the academic and technical standards required for participation in a class, program, or activity, but that person has a physical or mental impairment that limits one or more of their major life activities. Major life activities include, for example, seeing, hearing, walking, and speaking, and they can also include school-related tasks like learning, concentrating, thinking, and communicating. So what is required of students at the post-secondary level, which is different than requirements for those in primary school and high school levels? Well, number one, students must meet the college's standard admission requirements. A college cannot simply deny admission to a student because they have a disability. But the college's requirements for admission, such as a particular GPA or a test score, need not be lowered just because that person has a disability, okay? Students must also disclose their disabilities and initiate disability services to receive accommodations. Now, this is important. If a student has a disability, they aren't required to notify the school, but they may elect to notify the college, and at that point, that's when the college engages in the interactive process to determine what accommodation may be needed. Students must provide documentation of their substantial functional limitations to determine qualification for services, and they must engage in self-regulated learning. They're not entitled to the same level of support they may have received in elementary or middle or high school. Students must meet the college's essential requirements for courses and programs with or without reasonable accommodations. So what do these laws require of the college? The college, under these laws, is required to make reasonable accommodations in its practices, policies, procedures, and to provide auxiliary aids and services for persons with disabilities, unless to do so would fundamentally alter the nature of the goods, services, facilities, privileges, or classes that are offered, or if it would result in an undue financial or administrative burden on the institution. And I can tell you from research, there is very little, if ever, a time when the federal government says you don't have enough money to make an accommodation for a student, at least in terms of like a physical accommodation, or providing an interpreter, for example, or providing a particular piece of modified equipment that may help them in their classwork. So in other words, the college must provide appropriate academic adjustments and services where it's necessary to ensure that participants with disabilities have an equal opportunity for success to participate in the college's programs and services, again, unless doing so would change the essential requirements of the course or program. So this requires access and opportunity. It doesn't necessarily guarantee success for the student, however. Each student has to be accommodated on a case-by-case, course-by-course basis, depending on what their particular disability is and what the particular need is. The college is not required to, nor should it, compromise a course's essential requirements. The objective of an academic adjustment is to always accommodate the student's disabilities. Is not to dilute any scholastic requirements. So for example, the college may need to provide extended test time for a student, for example, as an accommodation. But the college is not required to, nor should it change the substantive content of the examination. So when faced with a request for accommodations, the college and disability services must assess whether an accommodation requested for a particular class or program would fundamentally alter the course requirements. And essential course or program elements are learning outcomes, which are fundamental to a course or program that must be demonstrated by all students, with or without accommodations. And to exclude any of those outcomes would be to fundamentally change the nature of the course of the program. There might be different methods by which you get to those course outcomes for that particular student, but the course and learning outcomes should be the same for all students. And an accommodation should not be granted if it's determined that doing so would alter those fundamental requirements of the course or program. And Dr. Agnew will talk a little bit later about how the college and your department, Student Services, would go about making those individual assessments. And she'll talk you through some examples as well. There are lots of different types of disabilities that we may see with students coming through your doors. And they all may require different sorts of accommodations. And remember that individuals can also have more than one disability at a time that you have to take into consideration when you're assessing the need for accommodation. We'll just briefly talk about some of the general types of accommodations. Medical disability, for example, if a student has asthma or diabetes, cancer, HIV/AIDS, epilepsy. There can be psychological disabilities that have to be addressed, anxiety disorder, depression, learning disabilities, inability to receive, process, or store, or respond to information, or an inability to speak or listen well and write and spell and compute. Neurological impairments, which I think we probably all see a lot of, the ADD and ADHD diagnoses seem to be some of the more common ones that we typically see and hear about from an accommodation need perspective. It could be other, severe things like brain tumors or Asperger's or other autism spectrum disorders. Some other, what I would say are kind of back in the day, kind of what you would think of as the more common disabilities would be hearing impairments or sight impairments or mobility impairments. If you had a student in a wheelchair that you have to accommodate, if they came into this room, they would need to sit on the front row, for example. It doesn't appear that there's a room. So you would need to make sure that the student has physical access and that there are no barriers to their ability to participate in a particular class. And disabilities can be temporary as well. They may not be these long-term chronic conditions, though they certainly can be, but they can be temporary disabilities as well. Let's walk through just one quick example, perhaps of an oral disability that I've had. Let's say a student comes and has a diagnosed auditory processing disorder. That's a type of learning disability, which is characterized as a weakness in the ability to understand and process auditory information. And that can affect their spelling, their reading, their written expression, and understanding. So here are some possible accommodations that might be considered for that particular student with that sort of disability. And remember, there's not necessarily one size fits all. And you might need to, think outside the box for each individual student and each situation. But some common accommodations that you might think about for this particular student would include providing assistive listening devices, allowing preferential seating, perhaps right in the middle, near the front, providing materials in alternative formats, sometimes in advance of class, allowing the recording of lectures, or allowing written communication rather than requiring that they raise their hand and have an active role in a participation discussion during the class. So those are just some examples for that sort of disability. Here's some other common accommodations for students with a variety of different disabilities that may need to be considered. Certainly architectural access. If you have a student who is in a wheelchair, and if there was no working elevator and the class was scheduled on the second floor of a building, but the elevator was broken. Well, what do? How do you get the student there? There may be a movement of the class for that time until the elevator is repaired, or a permanent reassignment. So making sure that your students have architectural access to the class locations. Other common accommodations are having note takers, or allowing for taped lectures, providing assistive technology, having interpreters. I know that y'all had interpreters for hearing impaired students in the past, providing distraction, reduced testing environments, providing for extended test times, providing for priority registration so that students with disabilities have the ability to get into classes and the locations and times that work best for their individual situations. And you also may need to make some attendance modifications, and there may need to be some exceptions to blanket policies. Now, on the last two, let me comment, and this may be more of a comment that needs to be directed to faculty members, and I can assure you we'll get there on Thursday when we give the presentation to them. But you need to know from a student services perspective. I'm aware that in certain higher college university settings, there may be faculty members who include information in their course syllabus that list a number of class rules and requirements, and for which a faculty member say, it's a zero tolerance policy, you abide by these rules. One could be no makeup exams, period. And I think that faculty have a right to set expectations, certainly. But they also need to know that having such blanket exceptions could violate the ADA responsibilities as well, okay? And so those hard and fast rules may not be appropriate in some instances with students with disabilities. And they may need to be accommodated, and there may need to be exceptions to that zero tolerance policy at certain times. So let's say you had a student who had cancer or some other chronic medical situation, and they needed to take a makeup exam because of their treatment situation. Those are accommodations that would need to be made, or adjustments that need to be considered, regardless of whether the faculty member's syllabus says zero tolerance, no makeup exams, period. So my message to the faculty members later this week will be, if they find themselves in that sort of situation, that if there's a concern about that and they aren't sure what to do, or they believe there should be no exception to their policy, they need to work with student services, the college's ADA advisor and her leadership, to make sure that the appropriate response and handling of the situation is taken for that student. Students with disabilities are in a protected class. The fact is, you must make accommodations where you can, and when the college, not to modify again, the requirements of the course, but the manner in which they go about those learning outcomes is what must be accommodated. Let me talk about some tips I have for you all in the student services, and some of this also will apply to faculty. But this first point really to you all as a student services staff. The ADA responsibility is a college-wide obligation. You have Ms. P. Ryan, who I understand is the relatively new ADA coordinator advisor, at least within this year, I believe. Previous experience, but new to this role in this at this college. She has that position as maybe the front line with a lot of the students, but all of you work in student services. This is a student services issue. Okay, this is not an only Mrs. P. Ryan issue. This is a student services issue. My recommendation to you is to assist your coworkers, assist your leadership, and making sure the college's obligations in this regard are followed. Back each other up to ensure that student disability needs and accommodations are timely and appropriately addressed. There may be situations where Ms. P. Ryan is out of the office. And a lot of times people don't think about the practicality of, when one person is out of the office, but she has a lot of responsibility for student contact. What happens if she's out taking a vacation day or has a sick day or something like that? When a student reaches out to the college and needs disability services and is unable to reach someone, then that could fall through the cracks. There could be a delay. And frankly, one of the reasons we're having this session, this predates Ms. P. Ryan, but there was a delay in getting a student some disability services. And the fact is, you need to back each other up. Somebody needs to forward phones, check an email, sign needs to be on the door, but you all need to be on heightened alert that these are student services issues. And just as if there was a financial aid issue, and let's say all of the financial aid personnel was out of the office, for a week at a conference. I don't know if that ever happens for that extended period of time. But if the student has a need, somebody needs to address it in a timely fashion. So my message to you and suggestion is recognize that you're all in this together. As student services particularly, you're here to serve students. And she may have an expertise that not all of you necessarily have, and Dr. Chucks and his staff have financial aid expertise that not everybody else has. But at least try to get them to the right people, be responsive, and let them know you're working on it and follow through to make sure the students feel like they are being served and that they, in fact, then are served. So just think about some of those practical things, backing each other up if you're not in the office. Who's checking your phone? Is there, out for a week on vacation, a sign on the door, I'm out of town, please see so-and-so. Directing people, maybe doing a voicemail message, if people call and left a voicemail for you. Leaving a voicemail message, I'm unavailable until such and such, please direct your call to so-and-so in the meantime. Or having an automatic email response as well could be a good tool. So think about those in your individual teams maybe as a way to practically serve your clients, who are your students. Another tip I have for you is, and this may be more so perhaps for a faculty member, but don't make assumptions about a student's ability or comment on a student's presumed abilities if the disabilities are not visible. Certainly if you have a student in a wheelchair, and you want to make sure they're getting in the right place, or if they need physical assistance, or if you had a blind or deaf student, that's, it's something that's all pretty obvious, open and obvious. But if someone doesn't, if you think maybe, well, I think they must have ADD or ADHD, that is not for you to project onto the student. Again, at this level of education, if a student has a disability and they want services, it's their responsibility to come to the college and ask for those services. Respect confidentiality requirements. Certainly, the ADA office processes the paperwork, and they have to get documentation from healthcare providers and that sort of thing. That information is not for faculty or others to see. The ADA coordinator will then send out a notice to faculty members of here are the accommodations that this student needs, but they don't need to get into the details of the individual student's medical situation. And also, if any of you have any questions about an issue that comes up during the course of you're talking with individual students, you always have the resources of the ADA office to contact, and you can always engage with them to talk about any concerns you may have. All right, now I'm going to turn the program over to Dr. Agnew, who many of you know. She's been an adjunct faculty member here for many, many years, and also serves as Student Disability Services Coordinator Director at the University of South Alabama.
Good afternoon, colleagues, friends.
Good afternoon.
If we live long enough, 100% of us will have a disability, I promise you. I didn't need these readers before a couple of years ago. So I promise you, if we all live long enough, what we're saying today will make sense to you. And you'll be glad that you heard it. At the University of South Alabama, I serve in the role of Assistant Dean of Students. So I supervise a number of offices, student conduct, talent search, Upward Bound, and I am the Director of Student Disability Services. So at USA, we have over 700 students who are registered on our campus with a disability. Those are the ones that are registered. There are probably twice as many that are out there who will never find their way to us. I serve as my institution's chief advocate for students with disabilities. I'm also chief protector of the institution when it comes to issues related to student disability services. So what Wendy's been talking to you about this afternoon is ADA compliance. And our students who have disabilities, they are not like any other student. That's natural, of course, we can see that. But they are a protected class of students. So as such, their grievance process, is beyond the walls of this particular institution. They can call the Office for Civil Rights, or they can go online to the OCR's website, and in 2 minutes file a complaint that might tie up 12 people, plus make you have to invest in some legal counsel to get the issue resolved. So what I'm talking about today, compliance, is very important. Any of you who have aspirations of moving up at a post-secondary institution, you will want to know a little bit more about institutional compliance. So cross-training with Ms. P. Ryan, reaching out to others who have experience there can help you, and that's a selfish motivation. Okay. All right, so let's talk a little bit about Bishop's ADA office. The primary responsibilities, of course, are to ensure access, physical access, also access to course materials. We want to ensure that students are protected from discrimination. What does discrimination look like? Very obvious, oh, you're a disabled person, you can't do this, you don't have access to that. Also, it can be very subtle, too. I'll give you an example. Are you familiar with this show where there's a young man who has Asperger's? His name is Sheldon. Okay. I had a situation where a faculty member at my institution had a young man in her class that reminded her of Sheldon. And so she started calling him Sheldon every day. Even when she called the roll in her class, she wouldn't say his name, she would call him Sheldon. So while she attempted to interject some comedy there, this was discriminatory in nature, and it hurt the young man's feelings. All right, so as Wendy mentioned, protect confidentiality of registered students. The ADA office is the only office that is tasked with knowing exactly what the disability is, and we maintain that in the strictest confidence. We want to ensure that academic accommodations do not compromise program standards. As Wendy mentioned earlier, access is what we're responsible for, not success. You know, we have to make sure that we level the playing field, not level the playing field, boost them up, push them over into success. Just level the playing field, giving them access. And ultimately, we want to empower students and make sure that they are self-advocates. We want them to feel empowered and engaged to represent themselves and to speak to faculty about their specific needs. Also, Bishop's ADA office is your campus resource for faculty, for staff, for students, even for the community at large. How many of you hold faculty positions as well? You teach classes. Okay, very good. College policies. This is the ADA Student Services Handbook, which is readily available. Students read this and understand what their obligations are as well. So it would behoove you also to know what is contained in the handbook. Also contribute to the updating of the handbook as is necessary. So what does all of this mean for faculty and staff? So those of you who hold faculty appointments here, ultimately ADA compliance in the classroom is your responsibility. You know, you are ultimately responsible for ensuring ADA compliance in your classroom. How do you do that? Well, you will receive a letter from the ADA advisor that indicates what accommodations students with disabilities in your course need. Also, it is your responsibility to include an ADA statement in your syllabus. So this helps students who are not otherwise acquainted with the ADA office find their way to that particular resource. All right. So what else you've got to do is to ensure that you are highly responsive to students who make requests that are related to disability accommodations. Those requests need to be approved in a timely fashion. As Wendy mentioned before, the purpose of this meeting is to ensure that we understand the obligation to, not put these students on the back burner, but to move forward in ensuring that they receive accommodations in a timely and responsive manner. Now, keep this in mind, and I bolded it here, that students are not required to seek accommodations. So they may be in a wheelchair, they may have one leg, they may be missing a hand, but if they do not consider themselves disabled, they are not required to seek accommodations. Also, accommodations are not applied retroactively. So what we mean by that is, let's say that a student registers with the office, the AD office, today. So from this point forward, they can receive accommodations. They can't get in the Wayback Machine and say, hey there, I need accommodations starting from September or August 20th or whenever school started. I tell my faculty at South that we view retroactive accommodations through the same lens that we view Bigfoot, unicorns, Easter Bunny, I hope not to break anyone's heart, Santa Claus. These things don't exist. We're unable to provide accommodations retroactively. And there's no obligation for you to do that either. I spend the bulk of my day in troubleshooting. I troubleshoot with faculty all day long because they have questions. And we tell them that there's no question too large or too small. We don't have a whole lot of room for error here in this kind of work, so we welcome the questions. Your ADA advisor is available to assist you with accessibility troubleshooting. You do not have to live in a vacuum. No man or woman is an island on this campus, not when you have an entire office devoted to ADA compliance. So contact Ms. Pirine if you have any concerns, if you need to collaborate. I've got all of her contact information here. She's located in the Student Life Complex, and many of you work just a stone's throw away from her. So some of the services that the ADA office provide, of course, include testing accommodations. As we've mentioned, those might include extra time. They could include an alternative format for the test. May even include a distraction-reduced environment. Also, there's adaptive technology. I don't know if you have any totally blind students on your campus, but we have a few on ours, and so we use a lot of adaptive technology to ensure that the playing field is level for those students as they matriculate through our institution. So accessible formats for course materials are very important. So she can work with you, Ms. Pirine can work with you on those. We've already discussed classroom modifications. There's also coordination of interpreters and other service providers, captionists, etc., braillers. It's a lot of moving parts to ADA compliance. And sometimes we have to consult with faculty to determine reasonable accommodations. At our institution, as I mentioned, we have over 700 students. We also have over 1,500 course sections that we have to ensure that are ADA compliant across many different disciplines, inclusive of undergraduate programs, graduate programs, colleges of nursing, medicine, and we also provide disability accommodations for Auburn's Harrison School of Pharmacy, which is located on our campus. My degrees are not anywhere near pharmacy or include STEM in any way, so we have to do a lot of consultation with faculty, especially about providing accommodations in a clinical environment. You've heard us talk about reasonable accommodations, so let's talk about what's unreasonable. Because some of us, and some of you, just might be naturally nice folks. You're going to help people no matter what. But there is a such thing as helping too much and being unreasonable. So if you're giving someone an unfair advantage or disadvantage, and that person has a disability, then we would consider that to be unreasonable. And again, if you're given retroactive accommodations, an example might be a student goes to see Ms. Pirine. She determines through the interactive process and a review of documentation that this student would be best served by having exams on an extended time basis at time and a half. So the person comes to you with their letter and says, you know, hey, I get time and a half. You know, can I retake those 4 tests I had with time and a half? Class, is this reasonable or unreasonable? Unreasonable, you're absolutely correct. Somebody's going to do it, but it's unreasonable. Okay, that's the example of a retroactive accommodation. Now, why is it important that we not give retroactive accommodations? Because if we start giving retroactive accommodations, then when the student goes to a faculty member who is going to follow the letter of the policy, they're not going to give that retroactive accommodation. So herein we have a problem, because my other 12 teachers did it, so it looks like it's an institutional practice. And now this instructor's not doing it, I'm being discriminated against. So don't overdo the accommodations. Okay, now the third one, an accommodation that prevents the student from learning or demonstrating mastery of a skill or concept as expected of other students. So for instance, let's say that you have a student who's in a clinical program and they're required to draw some blood, okay? But maybe they're missing a couple of fingers. They could actually do it with some extra time and some other supports, but if you tell that student, you just watch them do it, okay? You're preventing them from demonstrating mastery of that particular skill, okay? Now there are a couple of asterisks by this last one. Poses an undue burden, financial or administrative, on the college. It's really hard to prove that an accommodation would cause an undue burden, financial or administration, because the burden of proof is on the institution. For example, we have a totally blind engineering student at South. Do you know how much it costs to put one calculus book and in an accessible format for a blind student? Anybody want to take a guess? $60,000. One book, calculus. And you're like, my God, that would break our bank. You know, if we think about how long the student has to matriculate and what these other books look like. So, even though my personal departmental budget, you know, $60,000, I'm like, good grief, you know, nobody gets sign language interpreters this semester if I buy this book. I can't say that. So what the court will look at and what the Office for Civil Rights will look at is the entire institutional budget. So the entire institutional budget for the University of South Alabama is over $1 billion. And they will say, you can afford a $60,000 math book? What else you got? The burden of proof is on the institution. My very first year at, in this kind of work, a student asked for a very specific accommodation. And I did have to play the administrative burden card because what he wanted was for the University of South Alabama to pay the difference in his out-of-state fee for going to the University of Miami or some other school in Florida because he had seasonal affective disorder and needed to be in a warmer climate.
Okay.
Okay. So you all chuckle, you all laugh, but we're required to follow a process. So we had to follow an entire process before we could say no. And I said all that to say this. Try your best not to give the quick no. You know, even if you do get a request that makes you chuckle, take them through your full process. Because institutions get in trouble when they don't follow their own policies. So follow your policies. We've talked about determining and providing academic adjustments, auxiliary aids. There is a process. So the person submits their documentation. They have to initiate the process. So what they do is they say, hey, I'm on your campus, I have a disability, and here's my documentation, which is proof that I am on your campus with a disability. They have to initiate this. So then they meet with Ms. Piron. She looks at their application where they've made a specific request of accommodation. And she conducts an individualized assessment. So OCR and the courts say that you must conduct an individualized assessment, meaning that you have to meet with the students. You have to have an interactive process between the college and the student in determining academic adjustments and reasonable accommodations. All right, so what does this individualized assessment look like? All right, we try to determine the student's skills and abilities. They are providing data that talks about their functional limitations. And I would say for over 60% of the students that we serve on my campus, they have ADHD or a learning disability, and their functional limitations are related to that particular major life function, which is learning, comprehending, understanding. So after this individualized assessment is concluded, the ADA advisor will then craft an accommodation letter for faculty. So it includes the approved accommodations, and it may include some extended testing time or consideration for attendance or any number of things. So once faculty get this letter, they're responsible for providing those accommodations. You know, it's not a, oh, I'm going to think about this. It's a, this is what you must do for the student. This is our institutional obligation for the student who has disabilities. So let's talk a little bit further about some of those responsibilities. Okay. Only provide those accommodations that are on that letter. Now you can do more if everybody else is getting it. For instance, in my class, everyone gets extended time for tests. You can take as much time as you like. You don't need a letter, you don't need anything. So it's a universally designed class. I teach 2 classes back to back. Test days are the same for both. So if you're a student that needs a little bit more time, you can test through, you can start at the first class and test on through the second class. Now, if you're not finished in 4.5 hours, then we probably need to talk. But again, everyone gets that accommodations offered to the entire class. So if there are any concerns about the implementation of an accommodation, contact Ms. Pirine. Contact your ADA advisor. Some of our instructors, they might be brand new. Maybe they've never had a student with a disability or never received a letter before. So reach out. You know, she is there for support not only for you, for the student, but also for faculty as well. So if a student requests an accommodation, you know, they might come up to you and say, hey, Mr. or Miss or Doctor, I need a little bit of extra time. Well, we do them a disservice by just giving them the time and not sending them to the ADA coordinator, to the ADA advisor to get the accommodation. Also, do not lower course expectations. You know, that's not the design of the accommodations. That's not the design to give them less. And also ensure that your course materials are accessible. For instance, if you have your students watching a video, make sure that it's subtitled in case you have a deaf or hard of hearing student in the classroom. Now, when and how do you refer a student to the ADA advisor? There's an art to it. So if a student directly discloses to you, hey, you know, when I was in high school, I, you know, was tested for ADHD, and I used to take my test with someone else outside the classroom. So if they have directly disclosed to you a disability, then you can refer them directly to the ADA office. Now, if a student has not directly disclosed a disability to you, perhaps you see them struggling, then mention all the campus resources that are available to them, you know, including the ADA office. So I create the ADA sandwich, is what I tell faculty. So when you're mentioning all the services, start with the ADA office and mention that you've got the, you know, the LAC, and you've got this, you've got that, and we also have the ADA office. So you make the ADA sandwich, Because people have a tendency to remember the first things they hear and the last things that they hear. All right, so that's how and when you refer them to the ADA office. So if we can talk a little bit more about confidentiality. So, now, someone's symptoms, their actual diagnosis, any disability-related information, the name of their doctor or clinic, anything, keep that confidential. None of that should fall off the lips. You know, you should not be talking about this unless there is a verifiable need to know. So if there's a verifiable need to know, that's when you can share information that I mentioned previously about a student. Now, if you feel that you need to share this information with someone else, for instance, like if you feel you need to make another referral, talk to the ADA advisor prior to doing so. As I mentioned previously, students with disabilities are a protected class of students. They have the ability not only to follow your grievance procedures as listed in the student handbook, in the ADA handbook, and on several places in your website, they can also get their complaints resolved through the Office for Civil Rights. And again, these civil rights complaints, when they ask you to respond, it may be something very small or what you would consider to be just so minuscule that could easily be fixed with perhaps you having a conversation with that instructor, that department, that group of folks, but they don't want to waste time. So what they do is they'll tell you, well, you have to meet with everyone. You know, you'll have training for everyone, or you'll update this policy, or you'll update that policy. So while it may seem to be burdensome to you, in the long run, these kinds of things help to strengthen the institution. I feel that after today's meeting, some of you have learned a little bit more than you knew when you came through the door and would have the ability to answer some questions and help your institution fulfill its ADA compliance obligation. So without any further ado, we're open for questions.
Let me say that first of all, thanks for being here. In student services, as all these folk out there, most of them are really involved and entwined to what goes on as it relates to students with disabilities. Several of us have already worked together as a team to do it. So, I'm sort of anxious to kind of hear and see the reaction of faculty. From my perspective, you know, we do, before Ms. Piron came on board, we were following the processes and all. And there are times when we do have faculty who sort of, we have to go to and try to get them on board, you know, get them with division chairs to kind of get them on board. And then there are others, as you know from our past situation. But, you know, in an open forum like this, I really just want to commend these guys for what they do and how they work to make sure the students receive their needs from the various areas, all of them. So, and I personally think as dean that we've got a good process going on here to make sure students get what they need. So I commend them.
We have a hand in the back. Yes, sir?
Now, as a faculty member, our biggest issue is the students don't bring the letters to us. And a lot of times it would be midway the semester before we find out. I'll put it this way. In most cases, I can recognize that there's something not quite right. But it's not legal for me to ask or to suggest. Therefore, I have to basically wait. But I can do things that will kind of help the student along. Give an example. And one of the things that a young man, he was in class, and everybody walking the door, he offered him some candy. that's disturbing the class and other things. But my instructors, I instructed them not to say anything that would deter him or to cause him to feel like he's being pushed to the side. I suggested to them to simply say, well, why don't you bring it up here, and when people come in, we'll let people get candy if they want it or not. And that basically stopped him from doing that, rather than to say, you know, don't do that, you know. So the thing is, I'm here because I got something else to do the day that I'm supposed to be here, so I came. But as a faculty member, our biggest problem is the students don't bring the forms to us.
Well, I will say this, two things. One, a student could register their disability at any point during the semester. That's one thing. The other thing, I know I've kind of talked with Ms. Pirine about implementing a system. So at USA, we use a management software system so that the letters are automatically sent to faculty. Faculty can log into their own accounts and see which of their students has a letter. So one of those packages I think would be a good fit for Bishop, especially as you enhance your hybrid classes, your mini-term courses, and also, you know, as you globalize your education, you know, many of you will be teaching online courses, and so our students might not have much interaction with the physical campus. So having those tools, I think, would be a great assistance if that's the major problem, is just getting the letter. Sir?
So I know that we're talking about trying to make a push to where we can do all of our classes online at some point. And, you know, that's going to require us to, you know, look more like an online student. So what happens to the student who's purely online? You said that they have to come in and be assessed by the ADA advisor in person. Well, how do we handle that student that's ADA but, you know, across the country?
They don't have to have a face-to-face interaction. For instance, our entire graduate nursing doctoral program is all online. So we do Skype, we do WebEx, and we also talk to them on the phone. We just have to include them in the process. So we can't just get an application and some documentation and say, oh, this person gets X, Y, Z. It has to be interactive. And so interaction is whatever you determine it looks like. And for that particular program, you know, we do the WebEx and we do Skype so that we can talk to our students so that we can fulfill our obligation to have an interactive process. That's a great question. Are there others? Well, Wendy and I both thank you so much for your time and attention this afternoon. If you have not yet signed the sign-in sheet, you know, make sure you do that before you leave. If I can answer any questions for you at South Alabama, please feel free to call on me. Again, it was great to talk to you this afternoon.
And if you're sure you don't have any other questions, we can dismiss, but please ensure that you're on the sign-in sheet before you leave. Thank you all for your attendance.